Between 1947 and 1969, the U.S. Air Force investigated unidentified flying objects, commonly referred to as UFOs, as part of the Project Blue Book, which was based at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. More than 12,000 sightings were reported to the project, that's according to the Air Force, and 701 of them are still unidentified. But David Grush, a former intelligence officer who testified at last month's hearing, has claimed that the U.S. government has likely been aware of, quote, non-human activity since the 1930s. Joining me now to dig into some of this history is Greg Eghigian. Greg is a professor at Penn State University and is writing a book on the history of UFO sightings. Greg, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, my pleasure.
I was really looking forward to talking to you because you've been studying and writing about UAPs and UFOs for years. I think that, some folks who are just tuning into the issue, it's something new for them that they're studying. But again, you've been digging into this for a while. So to start us off, what do you think is the most important thing people should know when starting to learn about and starting to discuss UAPs and UFOs?
Oh, it's what should be obvious almost right from the start, that right from the very beginning of the first sightings, it's been really enveloped in controversy and in debate. There's never been any consensus or clear agreement among both civilians, people in the military, scientists about just exactly what was going on. And therefore, the entire phenomenon has been really shrouded in a lot of politics at times.
And so, we talk about that politics. It gets me right into my next question. Of course, there was that very high-profile hearing on Capitol Hill last month. It actually had less politics than other congressional hearings. It was more of a bipartisan basis. But I was curious, what are your main takeaways from that hearing? And you penned an op-ed afterwards, and you wrote, quote, "Just how historic the hearing was is up for debate." I'm curious what exactly you meant by that.
Well, because I think two things. One is all three of the witnesses had spoken out in public beforehand about this, so we kind of knew what they were going to say. The other thing is we didn't come away, therefore, with a lot of new information. Yes, people spoke under oath, but that was about it. I think the big takeaway for me is to actually zoom out a bit. It's really easy to get caught up in the personalities involved and in all the things that have happened subsequent to those hearings. I think one of the things that is really noteworthy about this, particularly in the case of David Grush, is that the entire sort of narrative about how to understand what he is saying and about the veracity of it has been built around his credibility. Do we believe this man? And what I want to say about that, and I think that's really important, is that when we make this stuff about assessing an individual's credibility, you're getting into people's character. You're getting into assessments of and speculation about a person's honesty, a person's integrity and virtue. And I think that partly explains why things have played out the way they have in the last week or so since then, because in a sense, it creates a kind of I think a false path for us. I think as we go down the road further along here, what we're really going to need to be grounded in is hard facts, data, artifacts, things like that. And I think that's what a lot of people are waiting for.
No, that's absolutely an interesting point. And we spoke to a few other lawmakers who have been part of this push for more transparency and this effort regarding UAPs on Capitol Hill. And one of their next steps is getting access to some of that sensitive information, that classified information that was discussed during the hearing. So, to get behind what are just some claims right now, to actually see the evidence behind it. So that is an interesting point. I also wanted to ask you, what do you think that lawmakers should be paying attention to specifically on this topic of UAPs? There are some lawmakers who are pushing to create a select committee, hold more hearings, both in Washington and field hearings. What exactly do you think they should be focusing on?
Well, it all depends on what you're really after here. I mean, of course, when it comes to national security, you're interested in, of course, finding out whether there's any data out there to indicate that there's reason to fear for national security issues when it comes to UAP. There seems to be, on the basis of what Arrow and Sean Fitzpatrick's group Arrow has concluded, in the sense that they have said that there are, in fact, many instances in which there are real physical objects out there that they can't explain, and that at the very least, they fear for pilot safety. So there's some evidence to indicate there's national security issues at this. On the other hand, I would say there's another side to this that often gets lost in the shuffle with the focus on the military, and that is science. That is the side that has gotten also explored a bit by this UAP study team headed by David Spergel through NASA, right? And that's another side to this issue of where might it be, in fact, civilian scientists who are independent, who really have no stakeholding position in all of these things, where might they fit into all of this?
You bring up David Spergel, and he's someone who I wanted to ask you about. He's the chairman of the NASA panel that is currently studying UFOs. And in June, he said, quote, "The current existing data and eyewitness reports alone are insufficient to provide conclusive evidence about the nature and origin of every UAP event." And he went on to say that NASA needs, quote, "better targeted data collection through data curation and robust analysis." So how can this data collection be improved, right? Because if we're going through the motions of collecting this data and then studying it, but now some experts are saying that the data that they have isn't sufficient enough to learn about this large phenomenon that we're trying to understand better. How can they better collect that data to overall paint a better picture of what's going on?
It's a challenge, and he admitted as such in that public meeting that was held. It sounds like that what first of all has to be done, which is what in fact that team was just beginning to do, was start to get around the table a bunch of people with a lot of different expertises and trainings and methods to begin to establish, as he put it, a roadmap. How might we go forward, not to get answers, but just to begin the process of asking the right questions and then trying to find a way to not only get data, but to collect it, store it, analyze it. All of that seems to me very much in flux. One of the challenges that they are facing, that he also admitted, is that, of course, some of this material, some of this data is classified material and data that is not accessible to this study panel and wouldn't be accessible to most civilian scientists. So that's going to be also a bit of a hurdle along the way.
Another hurdle seems to be, or rather than hurdle, but just the overall theme throughout the UAP journey up on Capitol Hill, seems to be the issue of transparency, right? This was an idea that lawmakers were really emphasizing, was that there's a lack of transparency. I want to read something that you wrote in your LA Times op-ed following the hearing. You said, quote, "The demand for greater government openness about UFOs has a long history dating back to the very first wave of flying saucer sightings in 1947. And you later added, as far back as the 1960s, however, others, like atmospheric physicist James McDonald, believed government's blasé attitude towards UFOs stemmed from incompetence and ignorance." So, you know, this whole idea of transparency and decreasing the stigma, as you mentioned right there, it seems like it's been an ongoing theme in this conversation about UAPs. I'm curious, now that it seems that the government is more invested, of course, we saw last month's hearing, lawmakers on Capitol Hill are very galvanized about it. There's a push for a select committee. Do you think that we'll see more transparency and a decrease of that stigma surrounding this very nuanced but highly interesting topic?
Well, I think transparency and stigma are maybe two separate things, but I think the one thing when it comes to transparency, at least, that we have to remember is everyone's definition of transparency is different. And particularly that applies when you're talking about the government and branches of government. So transparency isn't and doesn't mean the same thing to one group or to one institution that it might to another. I think we will be limited in the amount of transparency we will have. That is, I think, to be expected when you're dealing with things that involve, for instance, sensors and devices and technologies of surveillance that the military, maybe quite rightly, doesn't want to reveal anything about, or at least about its existence or workings. On the other hand, this story of transparency throughout history has been really marred and marked by a lot of starts, fits, stops along the way. And that is because, in fact, at times, as I say, nobody could be quite clear on what that transparency might look like. And so one of the problems I think that we have is that for a lot of critics of the government, when it comes to transparency issues involving UFOs or UAP, one of the big problems is that it's never been clear what kind of information will satisfy some of those critics. And in some cases, it seems that almost nothing will satisfy critics until they get the kind of result that they foresee or they believe is out there. And that also is one of the kind of challenges that I think people interested in transparency have ahead of them.
No, it's some fascinating dynamics there. I want to squeeze in one question from an audience member before we have to wrap up. This one's from Carlos Sims. He's an energy project engineer at the Washington State Department of Enterprise Services, and he wants to know, is there an increased number of UAP reports around U.S. military bases and nuclear facilities?
The newest results of a study that was done under the auspices of RAND just came out very recently, established or at least showed some indications that what we see is an uptick of reports, and in fact, a kind of a concentration of reported sightings that are within around 30 kilometers of military operations, not military installations or military bases or nuclear facilities, but where there are military operations. And this is a really interesting finding. The authors of this piece make the argument, one of the things this might indicate is that the government, and particularly the military, when they conduct these kinds of exercises, might want to inform the public a little more about them in advance so that you don't get a lot of false positives along the way.
Fascinating stuff, fascinating information. Greg Eghigian, thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks.
And that brings us to the end of our event today. Thank you so much to our speakers and to you for joining us. Remember, you can rewatch our event on thehill.com and on our YouTube page. Thanks for joining us for an out-of-this-world event. We had to. How could we not? I'm Mychael Schnell. Enjoy the rest of your day.